Daniel Marks had never considered himself the sort of man who would be caught up in neighborhood politics or disputes about property lines. At 58, after decades of running his small boat repair shop, he had deliberately chosen to step away from anything that might disrupt the quiet rhythm he envisioned for his retirement years. His decision to relocate to a small coastal town had been guided by longing for still mornings by the water, afternoons filled with slow, deliberate projects in his garage, and evenings watching the light fade over the bay from the worn rocking chair on his porch. The town had an easy charm. Narrow streets shaded by live oaks, weathered clapboard houses that seemed to lean into each other like old friends, and a handful of neighbors who would wave as they passed without pressing for conversation. Daniel liked that balance of friendliness and distance. It suited a man who valued both privacy and a sense of place. That morning had begun like any other in the week since his move. The air held a cool saltiness from the tide. Gulls called somewhere beyond the rooftops, and the faint thrum of a fishing boat's motor drifted in from the harbor. He brewed his coffee, flipped open the small local newspaper, and thought briefly about the weekend ahead. Perhaps a trip to the hardware store, maybe a visit to the market if the weather held. There had been talk in town of some new safety measures being rolled out in certain neighborhoods, rumors of inspectors marking properties, of temporary roadblocks. But Daniel had dismissed them as the kind of minor fuss small communities occasionally stirred up, things that tended to blow over quickly without touching everyone. Yet, as he stepped out onto his porch with his mug in hand, something immediately felt wrong. The first clue was the silence. No passing cars, no distant hammering from a renovation project, not even the chatter of the retirees who usually took their morning walk past his street. Then, as his eyes moved toward the front steps, he saw it, the thick gleam of metal against the muted wood of his door. At first he thought it was some sort of temporary latch or construction brace, but as he approached, the details resolved into something far more alarming. A heavy industrial chain, looped tightly through the handle and bolted into the frame, secured, with a massive steel padlock the kind used on shipping containers. The chain was taut, as if whoever had installed it had pulled with deliberate force to ensure there would be no give, no way to slip a tool into the gap. Hanging from one of the links was a laminated tag, bright yellow with bold black lettering that announced in block capitals, "Access restricted. Community lockdown in effect." The words felt surreal against the reality of his own front door. For a long moment, Daniel simply stood there, coffee cooling in his hand, staring at the barrier as if it might vanish if he blinked. His first instinct was confusion. Surely this was some kind of mistake, something meant for someone else's property. But the padlock was unmistakably fixed to his door, not a neighbor's. He set the coffee down on the porch railing and reached out to tug at the chain. The metal was cold and unyielding, biting into his palm. Whoever had done this hadn't simply draped it for show. It was fixed in place to withstand serious force. A second, smaller tag was clipped to the padlock itself, bearing a phone number and a terse instruction. Call for clearance. The number was unfamiliar, not local, and printed in the kind of generic typeface that gave away nothing about its origin. His mind began to race through possibilities. Had there been a fire nearby, a gas leak, some emergency that required sealing off certain homes? But if that were the case, why had no one knocked on his door? No one explained anything in person. He scanned the street again and found it still empty, though now he thought he caught the faint movement of curtains in a house across the way, a shadow pulling back quickly out of sight. He took out his phone, thumb hovering over the number on the tag, then hesitated. Something about the situation made him wary of giving away that he was home and aware. Instead, he stepped back inside to think, locking the side door out of habit, and in that moment the quiet of the morning no longer felt peaceful. It felt like the stillness before something breaks. Daniel stood inside his hallway, the filtered morning light casting thin stripes across the wooden floor, his coffee untouched on the counter, his mind turning over the image of that chain and padlock. The yellow tag with its terse message lingered in his thoughts like an unanswered question he couldn't shake. He'd dealt with property disputes before in his business days, had locked up boats in storage yards, and even argued with insurance adjusters over damages after storms. But this was his own home, a place that was supposed to be under his control. He retrieved his phone again and looked at the printed number. It wasn't from any area code he recognized, not from the coast, not even from the same state. Against his better judgment, he dialed, pressing the device to his ear as the line rang only once before connecting to a pre-recorded message. The voice was neither warm nor mechanical. It had that strange, careful neutrality of someone trying to sound official without actually giving away who they worked for. This property has been placed under restricted access in accordance with current community safety protocols, it said, each word clipped and deliberate. Please remain inside until further notice. Failure to comply will result in legal consequences. If you believe this is an error, leave your name and contact information after the tone and await instructions. The tone beeped, sharp in his ear. He hesitated, then gave his name and number, adding only, "I need someone to explain this in person," before ending the call. The moment he set the phone down, a prickle of unease crawled across his skin. He tried to tell himself that if this were legitimate, there would be a follow-up, someone in uniform, a printed notice from the county, a knock on the door to answer his questions, but no such comfort arrived. Instead, the house remained silent, the street outside empty. He walked to the back door, unlatched it, and stepped into the yard. The back gate was old cedar, weathered to a gray patina, and usually gave him easy access to the narrow alley that ran behind the row of houses. Today, though, he found a different kind of obstruction. A braided steel cable looped through the slats and secured with another padlock, this one smaller but just as solid. His pulse picked up. Whatever this was, it wasn't just about sealing the front door. It was about sealing him in entirely. The air seemed heavier now, as if the bright morning had thickened into something oppressive. He considered calling the police, but stopped himself. In his years running the shop, he had seen enough cases where local authorities deferred to official-looking actions without verifying them. If he called too soon, without something tangible to show them, there was a risk they'd mark him down as difficult or, worse, tip off whoever was behind this that he was pushing back. He needed information first, and that meant getting out to see what was happening beyond his property line. Inside the garage, he found his old toolbox and pulled out a short crowbar. It wasn't much against hardened steel, but the rear fence had a soft spot where the wood had warped. He worked quietly, prying just enough to slip through, wincing at the groan of the boards as they bent. The alley was empty, only the faint hum of distant traffic and the scent of the tide drifting on the air. He kept to the shadows, moving down to the corner where he could see the next street over. That's when he spotted it. A white utility van parked half on the curb, no company name, no license plates on the front. Two men stood near the back, one holding a clipboard, the other snapping photographs of a house's side wall. They moved with the efficiency of people who had done this many times before, not lingering, not speaking to anyone. Daniel stepped back into the shade of a garage and waited. After a minute, they packed their gear into the van and drove off without so much as glancing around. He recognized the house they had just left. It belonged to a young couple who had moved in around the same time he had. He hadn't seen them in over a week. Returning to his own property, Daniel slipped back through the fence and replaced the boards as best he could, his thoughts heavier than before. This was bigger than a mistaken lock on a door. Whoever was doing this had a plan, and it wasn't about temporary safety. When he stepped into the kitchen, a new envelope was on the counter near the door. The mail slot still swung slightly, telling him it had been dropped off in the last few minutes. There was no return address, just his name in neat block letters. Inside, a single sheet of paper carried the same printed header as the yellow tag outside. Access restricted. Community lockdown. The message was short. You have been placed under controlled access status. Compliance is mandatory. Attempts to remove physical security measures will be documented and addressed accordingly. For your safety, remain indoors. At the bottom was a small red stamp in the shape of a shield, the kind of generic emblem meant to suggest authority without belonging to any actual agency. Daniel read it twice, then again, each time feeling the absurdity twist tighter. For your safety, it claimed, yet no explanation, no signed name, no official seal from the city or county. He dropped the letter on the table, its sterile language echoing in his mind. Out the front window, movement caught his eye. The blinds in the house across the street shifted slightly before settling again. Someone was watching. He had no idea if they were friend, neighbor, or part of the same group that had locked him in. But one thing was certain. He was no longer just a homeowner enjoying a quiet morning. He had become a subject in someone else's plan, and that meant every choice he made from now on would matter. Daniel sat at the kitchen table for a long while after reading the letter, the muted tick of the wall clock reminding him of how quickly the hours could vanish when a person was caught between disbelief and hesitation. The chain across his front door was more than just an inconvenience now. It was a statement, a physical declaration that someone else had taken control over the threshold of his home. The cable across the back gate meant there was no simple way out without breaching something. And while he could force his way through, he understood enough about how situations escalated to know that doing so recklessly could be used against him. Later, his years running the boat shop had taught him a kind of practical patience. Gather the right tools, plan your moves, and act when you have the advantage, not just because you are angry. He decided that before he took any visible action, he needed someone outside his house to know what was happening, someone who could speak for him if things turned worse. There was a man 2 doors down, Frank Rudd, a retired mail carrier who had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years and knew everyone's history whether they wanted him to or not. Daniel trusted him enough to walk over unannounced, but walking over wasn't an option. So he went to the garage again, slid open the warped fence panel, and stepped into the alley for the second time that morning. The walk to Frank's place was quick, but Daniel still felt exposed. The alleys were narrow, lined with fences and sheds, and any moment someone could step out from behind one. When Frank opened his back door, his face shifted from casual curiosity to quiet concern the moment Daniel explained about the chains and the letter. Frank didn't laugh, didn't dismiss it. He simply said, "You're not the first." He told Daniel that 2 weeks earlier the Morgan family down the street had their front and back doors locked from the outside in the same way, with no notice except a printed tag. Frank had seen them trying to talk to a man in a gray jacket who arrived in an unmarked SUV, but after that the family had vanished. House empty, curtains drawn, no sign of them since. According to Frank, nobody in the neighborhood had seen a moving truck or any relatives come to help them. Daniel listened carefully, committing the details to memory. He asked Frank if he would keep an eye on his place for the next few days and note down anyone who approached it, especially vehicles without markings or plates. Frank agreed immediately, promising to write down times, descriptions, and even take a few discreet photos if he could manage. With that, Daniel slipped back the way he had come, feeling a small measure of relief that at least one other person understood he wasn't imagining things. That relief didn't last long. By the time he returned, a thin strip of paper had been taped to the inside of his storm door's glass. So thin he hadn't noticed it from the kitchen earlier. In small type, it read, "Reminder. Access restrictions remain in place. Do not tamper with safety measures." The idea that someone had been close enough to his door to tape it from the outside while he was only steps away in the alley unsettled him more than the chain itself. It meant they were watching his movements closely, timing their approach for when he was out of view, and it reinforced the feeling that whatever was happening was coordinated with precision. He spent the afternoon moving through the house, noting points of vulnerability: windows that didn't lock tightly, the sliding door to the sunroom, the basement hatch that opened to the side yard. By early evening, as the sky turned a burnished gold and the streetlights flickered on, he was in the upstairs study, looking out at the street through a narrow gap in the curtains. That was when he saw it. The same white van he had spotted earlier in the day, rolling slowly past before stopping 3 houses down. 2 figures got out, both wearing the kind of reflective vests used by utility workers, and began walking the property line of an older house, taking measurements and jotting notes. Daniel stayed still, watching them work with mechanical efficiency, then climb back into the van and drive away without speaking to anyone. He resisted the urge to follow. He had promised himself to keep his actions deliberate, not impulsive. Instead, he wrote down the time, their clothing, the make and dents on the van, and a partial plate number he caught when they turned at the corner. Later that night, just after midnight, he woke to the faint crunch of gravel outside his bedroom window. The sound was subtle, the kind you might mistake for an animal moving through the yard, but it carried a human rhythm. Slow steps, a pause, then another. He slid quietly out of bed, padded to the window, and peeked through the blinds. A figure stood in the dim light close to his porch, holding what looked like a small flashlight or camera, sweeping it across the front of his house. Daniel didn't move, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness, and saw the glint of metal in the person's other hand, possibly a key ring or a tool. The figure stepped back, glanced toward the street, then walked briskly away, disappearing into the shadows between 2 houses. Daniel waited another minute before pulling the curtain shut. He knew now that the chain on his front door was not meant to be permanent in the traditional sense. It was a tool of intimidation, a way to signal that he was under control, to see how he would react. They were testing him, watching him, and perhaps waiting for him to make a mistake. That realization tightened something in his chest, but it also sharpened his focus. He could not let frustration push him into rash action. Instead, he needed to stay 1 step ahead, document everything, and make sure that when the time came to challenge this, he had more than just suspicion on his side. The following morning, Daniel awoke with the lingering memory of the figure in the yard still playing behind his eyes, the kind of image that didn't fade with daylight. He brewed his coffee without turning on the lights, choosing instead to keep the house dim so that anyone outside would have a harder time seeing him move from room to room. The chain across the front door was still there, the yellow tag swaying slightly in the breeze that crept through the frame. He took the long way around the kitchen, pulled the warped board aside on the back fence, and slipped into the alley again, his steps careful to avoid the loose gravel that might give him away. Today, he wasn't heading to Frank's. Instead, he had decided to make a stop at the small law office on the other side of town where an attorney named Caroline Dent worked. She had a reputation for being both thorough and blunt, and though Daniel didn't know her personally, he had seen her speak at a community forum about property disputes months earlier. It was a risk leaving the house while these so-called restrictions were in place, but the alternative, doing nothing, was worse. He took the alleys and back streets, moving with the practiced wariness of someone who understood the value of staying unremarkable. When he reached Caroline's office, the front blinds were half drawn, and the small bell above the door chimed as he entered. She looked up from her desk, expression guarded at first, then shifted to mild curiosity when he introduced himself and gave a condensed version of his problem. She listened without interrupting, her fingers laced together, eyes narrowing only slightly when he mentioned the white van and the unmarked workers. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "If what you're telling me is accurate, someone is acting under the pretense of authority without actually having it. That's not just a civil matter. It could be criminal." Daniel felt a flicker of relief at her directness. She asked if he had documentation, and he produced the yellow tag, the letter, and the note taped to his door. She examined them closely, pointing out the absence of any official seal from the county, the generic emblem, and the vague wording. The problem, she continued, is that unless someone in actual authority challenges this, the appearance of legitimacy is often enough to keep people compliant. They're banking on fear and confusion. Daniel asked what she recommended, and she told him to start building a record. Times, dates, descriptions, photographs if possible, and witness statements from anyone who had seen activity at his property. She offered to draft a formal inquiry letter to the local code enforcement office, which would force them to respond on the record, even if just to deny involvement. As they spoke, Daniel noticed a faint movement outside the frosted glass panel of the door, just a shadow passing, but slow enough to make his pulse skip. A few minutes later, as he was leaving, he spotted a black sedan parked across the street, engine idling. The driver's face was obscured by the angle of the windshield, but he could feel the weight of someone's gaze following him as he walked away. He didn't look back more than once. By the time he reached his alley entrance, the sedan was gone. Back at home, the chain on the front door was gone. For a brief, absurd moment, he thought the matter might have resolved itself, but stepping inside erased that hope. The living room window was cracked open, the latch forced, and several drawers in his desk were open, contents disturbed. It wasn't the work of someone searching for valuables. His laptop and tools were untouched, but rather someone looking for something specific. His gut told him it was the documents he had kept about the house, the deed, the closing paperwork, and a folder of correspondence with the previous owner. Sure enough, the folder was missing. A wave of cold anger moved through him, not just at the intrusion, but at the precision of it. They hadn't damaged anything beyond the latch. They hadn't left obvious signs of a break-in that would draw police attention. They wanted him to know they had been there, but not in a way that would create a formal record. That afternoon, Frank knocked at his back gate, his face grim. He said that while Daniel had been out, a pair of men in gray jackets had come to the front door, glanced around, and then walked around the side of the house as if inspecting it. One of them carried a clipboard, the other a camera. Frank had taken down the time and their general appearance, but from his distance he couldn't get photos without giving himself away. Daniel thanked him, feeling the knot of tension in his chest tighten further. He spent the evening moving the remaining important papers and small valuables into a weatherproof bag, which he stashed in the crawl space under the garage. He also installed a small motion sensor he had found in his toolbox, rigging it to chime quietly inside the house if someone entered from either the front or the back. That night, just after 2 a.m, the chime sounded. He slipped out of bed, careful not to make the floorboards creak, and moved to the front window. A single figure stood at the edge of his porch looking down at the threshold where the chain had been. After a long moment, the figure turned and walked away into the darkness. Daniel didn't follow. Instead, he wrote down the time, the weather, and every detail he could recall about their stance and movement. The next day, he returned to Caroline's office with this new information. She was unsurprised, saying it fit the pattern of intimidation tactics she had seen in other cases. What was unusual, she noted, was the lack of any paper trail. No notices filed with the county, no utility work orders, nothing that would justify this kind of physical restriction. They're either operating completely off the books, she said, or they have someone in a position to make things vanish from the record. Hearing it aloud confirmed the unease Daniel had been carrying. This wasn't an isolated overreach. It was an organized effort, and if they were willing to chain his door and enter his home without force that would draw police attention, they were also willing to keep pushing until he either left willingly or made a mistake they could use against him. 2 days passed with no further sightings of the white van or the gray-jacketed men, but Daniel had learned enough about patterns of pressure to know that a lull rarely meant the problem was over. It was a pause, the kind that preceded the next move. He kept his routines quiet and irregular, moving between rooms with the blinds drawn, leaving the lights on in unpredictable patterns at night, and making sure the motion sensor batteries were fresh. Frank continued to watch from his own porch, and on the 3rd evening he knocked at the back gate again, this time with something more troubling. A different neighbor, a woman named Evelyn from the next block, had approached Frank to ask if Daniel was in some kind of trouble. because earlier that afternoon she had seen two men in dark windbreakers speaking with a man in a county inspector's jacket outside Daniel's house. They stood at the front step for several minutes, glancing at clipboards and occasionally pointing at the roof and windows as if conducting some kind of evaluation. Evelyn said she thought nothing of it until she noticed that the county seal on the inspector's jacket looked slightly wrong, the lettering uneven, as though it had been hastily printed onto a patch. By the time she decided to take a closer look, all three had walked around to the side of the house and out of her sight. Daniel thanked Frank for passing it along and made a note to mention it to Caroline at their next meeting. That night, unable to shake the unease, he decided to check the perimeter himself. With a flashlight set to its lowest beam, he walked the length of the fence line, crouching near the baseboards and inspecting the ground for signs of recent disturbance. Near the back corner of the property, where the alley fence met the garage wall, he found a fresh set of surveyor's stakes hammered into the soil, each topped with a strip of orange flagging tape that fluttered faintly in the night breeze. The stakes formed a short line that stopped abruptly at the garage as if marking a boundary change. He knew without needing to check that these hadn't been there the previous evening. They were a message, a quiet but unmistakable declaration that someone was laying the groundwork for a claim on his land. The following morning, a plain white envelope slid under his door. Inside was a single sheet with a printed heading, Preliminary Property Adjustment Notice. The text was maddeningly vague, stating only that an evaluation is underway to determine the suitability of the premises for adaptive community use, and that access restrictions may remain in place until the process is complete. There was no signature, no agency name, just a reference number and the same red shield emblem that had appeared on the earlier tag. Daniel read it 3 times, the hollow bureaucratic language echoing in his mind, before tucking it into the growing folder of documents he kept hidden under the floorboards of the garage. Later that day, he took the back route to Caroline's office, the stakes still heavy in his thoughts. She studied the notice with a frown, her fingers tapping against the desk. "They're escalating," she said flatly. "This isn't just intimidation anymore. They're putting down markers, literally, to create the appearance of a legal process. If those stakes stay in place long enough and they produce a falsified map or survey, you could be facing an uphill battle to prove they don't have a legitimate claim." She advised him to photograph every stake and its position, which he did on the walk home, careful to include identifiable landmarks in the frame. That night, the photographs were backed up onto 2 separate USB drives, one hidden in the crawlspace and the other slipped into an envelope addressed to Caroline. By the next morning, the stakes were gone. The bare earth where they had been was tamped flat, as if to erase all trace. In their place, lying against the base of the garage wall, was a length of heavy chain coiled neatly, a new padlock dangling from one end. There was no note, no explanation, just the silent implication that it could be put to use again whenever they chose. Daniel carried the chain inside, set it on the workbench, and stared at it for a long time. It was both a taunt and a warning, proof that they could come and go without his consent, and that they were willing to remind him of it. He called Frank to let him know what had happened, and Frank's response was steady but grim. "They want you rattled, Daniel. They're pushing you to make the first wrong move so they can justify whatever comes next." Daniel understood, but the pressure was building. He could feel the boundaries closing in, not just the physical ones marked by chains and stakes, but the psychological ones formed by uncertainty and isolation. The only way forward now was to keep his head clear, keep gathering proof, and wait for the moment when their overreach crossed a line visible to more than just him. The break in the standoff came on a gray morning when the air felt heavy and charged, the kind of weather that made the bay look like dull metal under the clouds. Daniel had been in the garage sorting through the last of his stored tools when the motion sensor chimed twice in quick succession, a pattern that meant someone had crossed the front threshold and lingered. He moved to the side window in time to see 2 men in gray jackets, different from the earlier crew, kneeling by the front door with a heavy canvas bag between them. One worked quickly, fitting a chain through the handle while the other pulled out a handheld device that looked like a seal press, crimping something onto the lock. Daniel's first impulse was to confront them, but he stopped himself, forcing his hands to unclench. Instead, he quietly backed away, slipped through the fence panel and looped around to Frank's yard, where he knew there was a partial view of his own porch. From there, he watched as a black SUV pulled up to the curb. A man in a dark suit stepped out, spoke briefly with the two at the door, then handed over a slim folder before returning to the vehicle. The SUV idled for less than a minute before driving off, the men in gray following soon after, leaving the chain firmly in place. Frank muttered something under his breath about the suit looking familiar, maybe from a county meeting years ago, but neither of them could place the face with certainty. Daniel returned to his garage and retrieved the camera he had been keeping ready for exactly this scenario. He photographed the chain, the crimped seal, and the faint scuff marks on the porch where the men had knelt. Then, without touching the chain, he called Caroline. She didn't hesitate, told him to meet her in 20 minutes outside the county records office. When he arrived, she was already speaking with a contact inside, a records clerk she apparently knew well. They reviewed property filings and permits, and within half an hour, Caroline had what she needed: confirmation that there was no active order restriction or survey request tied to his address. Armed with that, they drove straight to the county prosecutor's office, where Caroline insisted on filing a formal complaint for unlawful interference with private property and unauthorized entry. The prosecutor, a tall man with a reputation for caution, read through the documents and examined the photographs Daniel had taken. His expression hardened as he asked a few pointed questions about the seal on the lock and the SUV's presence. "If these men were acting under any legitimate authority, it's not coming from here," he finally said. "We'll treat this as criminal trespass and tampering." He dispatched 2 investigators to Daniel's house that same afternoon. By the time they arrived, the chain was gone, the porch swept clean of any visible marks, but Daniel's photographs and the timestamps on them were enough to keep the case open. The following day, word reached him through Frank that the black SUV had been seen parked behind a shuttered municipal building on the edge of town. Later that week, law enforcement executed a quiet seizure of the vehicle and took one of the gray-jacketed men into custody. No details were given, but Daniel could tell from the guarded tone of Caroline's phone call that the move had disrupted more than just the operation targeting his property. That night, for the first time in weeks, he slept without waking to phantom noises in the yard, though the relief was tempered by the knowledge that whoever had orchestrated the scheme was still out there. The fight was no longer just about his front door or a coil of chain. It had become a matter of pulling whatever shadow authority these people claimed into the open, where it could be challenged in a court that actually recognized the law. In the weeks that followed the arrest, the neighborhood seemed to exhale a breath it had been holding for too long. The white van never returned. The unfamiliar figures in gray were nowhere to be seen, and the quiet streets began to look again like the place Daniel had first moved to, though the change in atmosphere was more fragile than it appeared on the surface. The county prosecutor's office confirmed that the investigation was ongoing and that charges were being prepared, though the specifics remained sealed, a fact that both reassured and frustrated him. Caroline helped him file for a permanent protective order, and the judge signed it without hesitation, citing the documented history of interference and intimidation. Daniel replaced the locks on every door, reinforced the gates, and installed a proper camera system that stored its footage in multiple locations. Neighbors who had kept their distance during the tense weeks began stopping by, first to offer cautious greetings, then to speak in low voices about their own encounters. Odd visits, unmarked vehicles, vague notices left in mailboxes. Some admitted they had been afraid to say anything while it was happening, worried they would be targeted next. A few, like Frank, were already talking about forming a small group to share information and watch out for one another, an idea Daniel supported, though he knew it would take time for trust to settle back in. On a mild afternoon, he stood on his porch, the boards warm under his feet, the air carrying the briny tang of the bay, and felt the difference between the silence now and the silence that had hung over the street before. This was a quiet earned through persistence and exposure, not fear. The chain, the lock, the papers, they had all been removed, but the memory of them remained, a reminder of how quickly the ground beneath you could shift if you weren't paying attention. Daniel had not chosen this fight, but he had seen it through, and in doing so had left a mark that would make it harder for anyone to use the same tactics here again.